So recently, I did the video where I talked about comic dubs and dramas, and the reason I did that, I should say, is because I wanted to talk about the recent comic drama dub that I had discovered. Now, comic dubs and dramas had been around for years here on YouTube, but the most recent one I discovered was by Natalie Guest, and she had been doing this, at least this comic drama dub, if you will. She'd been working on this along with others since February of this year. And her most recent part came out, which was the second part, came out in April. And when I sent her the video link of me talking about this, she messaged me back by saying that, you know, they're going to be working on they're currently, I should say, working on the other two parts to release them out simultaneously and then take all four parts and merge them together. And the comic drama and dub she was working on, that she plans to do this with, along with her friends, her colleagues, if you will, is Mobius 30 Years Later, which is the Sonic Universe 4-part issue story arc that they did several years ago, or many years ago, and served basically as a conclusion, if you will, to the entire Mobius Years Later story arc. Now, in case you guys are wondering what Mobius Years Later is, and that's why I'm doing this video, let me give you a little bit of an idea of what it is. Now, originally, Ken Penders, from what I understand, and you know, if you want to take my word for it, that'd be great. If not, you can look it up yourself here by Googling it or Binging it, if you will. But anyway, Ken Penders originally wanted to create a storyline that looked into what the future possibly could be or would be. And the original plan was to release this in the Knuckles comic, which was a spin-off of the main Sonic comic, and dub it Knuckles 20 Years Later. Unfortunately, that didn't happen because the Knuckles comic was canceled after 30-something odd issues. I think it was like 33, I believe. It was canceled, so Ken took the concept, reworked it, and presented it in 10 issues as mainly a backup story called Mobius 25 Years Later. I think the final part of that was in issue 141 or 142, and it was around that issue where he basically started out the comic with Mobius 25 Years Later as the main story, and then the other story that connected to the main story continuity was the backup, if that makes any sense. But yeah, he did this for several issues. I don't know if it was 10 issues or so, if he just presented Mobius 25 Years Later every now and then. I got to go back and read the issues myself, but basically he ended the first act, I guess you could say, or the first part of Mobius 25 Years Later, on a cliffhanger. But here's what's interesting. Before we got to Mobius 25 Years Later, the seeds had been planted. Like I said, the original idea was for the Knuckles comic to be the home of the story arc, or at least the first part of it, the prologue, the prelude, if you will, to the story arc. But because of the cancellation, he had to rework a lot of things that he had originally planned. And one of them was the story of Jenna Ka, or basically our first look. Well, the story of Jenna Ka, as sonicretro.org puts it. But yeah, issue 106 of Sonic the Hedgehog, in a backup story called Reflections, which I think went for a couple of issues, presented us to Lala Sue, who is in the future the daughter of Knuckles and Julie Sue. But when this issue came out, we didn't know that. And I think it was in this issue, again, I gotta go back and read it, she kind of gave herself the name Jenna Ka so that there wouldn't be any suspicions as to who she was and where she came from. Because she had basically time traveled to the present from the future and was encountering younger versions of her dad, her mom. She was seeing her grandmother, her step-grandfather, all that. She was seeing all this unfold as it was happening because she had traveled back in time. Anyway, Reflections, which served as that backup story from 106 to I think 109 or 108 or something like that, basically laid the foundation down, was kind of like the prelude, planted the seeds, if you will, for what was to come. And what was to come happened 25 issues later from Lala Sue's first appearance in 131, where, like I said, the backup story was always a Mobius 25 Years Later continuation from the last issue, before concluding, I think 10 or 9 or 12 issues later, with the Mobius 25 years later story arc concluding as a main story for the comic, while the main continuity story was the backup. Again, if that makes any sense, hopefully it does. If not, I do apologize. But that's basically how Ken had worked it. And in the process, Ken had gone on record, even when this first happened, basically when the Mobius 25 years later appeared, Ken Penders had gone on record by stating that this was indeed the future. This was indeed what was going to be. And what's interesting is when he ended it on a cliffhanger, he also ended it in a way by kind of alluding to the fact that what we saw possibly will be the future, but now we're not so sure. But Ken Penders was very adamant that what he had done with Mobius 25 years later, continuation or not, was indeed the future that would be. However, Ian Flynn, when he came on board as the head writer, he decided to continue it in the main book. And he continued this, I think, for about 4 issues as a main story in the main book. And it was a continuation of the cliffhanger from Ken Penders' original story. But it was through this that Ian Flynn had established the fact that, what we were seeing now as a continuation to the first part that Ken Penders had done, that this new alternate timeline that was occurring and everything basically wiped out any possibility of 25 years later being the future. Because now Ian Flynn had established the fact that Mobius 25 years later was an alternate universe. It was now an alternate timeline. There's an alternate realities, universe, stuff like that. And when Ian Flynn made this known, and those working on Archie Comics backed him up on it, Ken Penders, from what I remember, came online and basically tried to debunk that. He tried to basically counteract that by saying no. He tried to counteract that by saying no, because he pretty much tried to state that the plan always was that Mobius 25 years later, no matter how it was going to be concluded, was indeed the future. That this was going to be the future to be for Sonic, Sally, Knuckles, Julie Stu, Lala Stu, all of them. This was going to be the future, tried and true to the prime continuity of the original main story. But Ian Flynn basically came out by creating the sequel. Sorry about that. By creating the sequel and stating that that wasn't the case. That this was now a different universe. This was a different reality because it was an alternate timeline. Because it was a timeline that had gotten changed because of what Sonic had done or attempted to do at the end of the first part that Ken Penders had wrote. And even after this second part that Ian Flynn helped conclude to Ken Penders' original, Ian wasn't done. Ian then, in Sonic Universe, which was a more successful spin-off than the Knuckles comic, decided he was going to continue the Mobius years later story arc, or conclude it, I should say, by giving us what would be known as Mobius 30 years later. And he used basically Silver as a means to try to point out the fact that, again, this wasn't, the real future. This wasn't the real continuity. That this was an alternate reality, an alternate timeline. This is more of a what-if scenario. Like what Marvel would do with the what-if comics, like what they're going to be doing with the what-if animated series on Disney+. That's basically how Ian Flynn was presenting this now with 30 years later, and even previously with his continuation of Ken's story arc with the whole part 2 to 25 years later. To 25 years later, Ian Flynn basically tried to present it as a what if, not a yeah, this is going to be the future. No, it's a alternate universe, alternate reality, what if scenario. And by making 30 years later a Sonic Universe exclusive story arc for its conclusion, he basically wanted to use this story arc, this 4-part run, if you will, as a means of doing that, of basically saying, yeah, this is a what if, it's an alternate timeline, here's Silver to prove that, here's this to prove that, they basically, he basically, I should say, said, tried what he could. He tried what he could to establish the fact that this was not what Ken Penders originally had penned anymore, that this was, completely different. And he even went on record, along with others, like I said, that were on the book with him, by basically stating that what Ken Penders tried to do was not right. That basically Ken Penders' attempt to say, yeah, 25 years later, that's the future. No matter what happens afterwards, leave that up to your imaginations, that's the future. And I think what Ken was planning to do, had he stayed on the book, was give it a conclusion, thus establishing that yes, this was the future that was meant to be. But again, he never had the chance to do that, since he had left the book after Line of Succession, which was his final story arc on the main title, on the main book, and then Ian Flynn took over afterwards. So, long story short, Mobius years later will go down, I should say, as one of the more convoluted, controversial scenarios, comic book story scenarios. I think any comic book, in history, if not recent history, has ever gone through. I mean, when you think about it, there's a lot of stories that have been convoluted throughout the years, have been controversial, have been altered because of different writers and everything. And Mobius years later falls into that category of, one writer had plans for it to be one way, but then another writer comes in, picks up the slack, and then basically says, no, I'm going to take it another way. So, yeah, it's just one of those scenarios to when you look at something like this, you look at the potential it had, and then you see that basically that potential went askew. I mean, I'm not saying that Ian Flynn didn't do his best job with the Mobius years later portion of the Sonic comic book franchise. I'm not saying he didn't. I thought, in honest opinion, I know he's done a lot of crappy stuff, or controversial stuff, I should say, crappy as well, depending on how you view it. I will say that he did a decent job here with the Mobius years later arcs. He did a decent job in trying to conclude what Ken Penders had left off on a cliffhanger originally. So I'll give him credit there. And I will give him credit that he did set up a potential new world, what if future world, as he puts it, for the Freedom Fighters when it comes to Mobius years later. I mean, heck, you want the honest truth? You want the honest truth? You know what he did? And this is weird. You'll have to look at the ending of Mobius years later to kind of see what I'm saying. Or Mobius 30 years later to kind of see what I'm saying. But he pretty much, I guess you could say in a group shot, teased that Melody Prower, who is Mina and Tails' daughter in the future, has a thing for Antoine and Bunny's son. And I think his name is Jock. And that Bunny and Antoine's daughter might have a thing for Sky Prower, who is Tails and Mina's son. She might have a thing for Sky Prower. And the daughter of Antoine and Bunny is known as Belle. So, yeah, he kind of teased certain ships there. And it's like, okay, is he planning to capitalize on these in the future? but even if he was, he never had a chance to do it since the comic was canceled after 290 or 291. But again, the point is, yeah, he pretty much, I'll give him credit for at least teasing a possible relationship between, Melody and Jock, and potentially something between Sky and Belle. I mean, he pretty much set up the fact that Argyle, who is Vector the Crocodile's son, is the boyfriend of Lala Sue. Go figure. But anyway, yeah, I'll give Ian Flynn credit. I'll give him credit for picking up the slack when he did. But, the thing is, if you're going to continue somebody's story, at least in my opinion, pay respects to what they had planned. Even if you want to put an asterisk next to, let's say, the yellow box in the corner, in the upper right hand or left hand corner, or bottom left hand or bottom right hand corner, you want to put an asterisk and saying, this is the future, and then put the word true with quotation marks in between it, in front and back of it, if you will. If you want to go like, this is the quote unquote true future of Mobius, and then put an asterisk next to the true, or put before the word the, if you catch my drift. If you want to do that, then fine. Go and do that, so that way you're pretty much saying, yeah, this is the true future, quote unquote, but not really. But you're not straight out saying that. And if you did something like that, if Ian Flynn did something like that, I think Ken Penders wouldn't have been so defensive about the fact that, hey, why aren't you, acknowledging that this is the future? This is indeed the true future. Why aren't you doing that? So, anyway, though, yeah, Mobius Years Later, besides that, is one of the more controversial, convoluted story arcs in the Sonic the Hedgehog comic book, in the Archie Sonic comic book history. And, I think, honestly, you just got to interpret it the way you want to interpret it. Me, I'm going to be one of those people that look at it and say, as much as I understand where Ian Flynn's coming from, I got to go with Ken Penders, and I've got to acknowledge that what we got originally and what was trying to be resoluted, later on, and then concluded later on as well by Ian Flynn, that I have to look at that as the legit future. Because if you're going to continue something, in my opinion, you need to keep it true to what the original person that created it had envisioned it to be. So, anyway, that's just my take on Mobius Years Later, 25 years later, 30 years later, X years later, whatever you want to call it. Let me know what your thoughts are. How do you feel about Mobius Years Later? What did you think about it? How do you view it? Do you view it from what Ken had originally wanted it to be, or do you kind of agree with what Ian views it as? Let me know down below. Comment if you like. Sorry if I rambled a little bit or sound like I was kind of, pausing for a minute here and there, because I was trying to think about what I was going to say. Again, when I do things, when you do videos and stuff unscripted, that's what happens, But let me know what your thoughts are. Comment down below. Let me know what your thoughts are on the live chat during the premiere, and I will talk to y'all later.